Hi folks, and welcome to our video lecture on the close-up and the face on the screen. So in this unit we're going to be talking about two silent era film theorists, the Hungarian film theorist Bela Balazs and the French film theorist and filmmaker Jean Epstein. The close-up is something that is discussed by almost every single classical film theorist. It is, for obvious reasons in many ways, something that a classical film theorist would find interesting because it seems to exemplify one of the unique kinds of images that distinguishes film from theater and the other arts. But we want to focus on these two theorists who are, above all, the most famous for their enthusiasm and investigation of the close-up as a technique, and in particular, the face on screen. So let's just go back to our list of the catalog of distinctions between film and theater that we did on day one. These were the categories that most interested Munsterberg. He was very much interested in the manipulations of space and time, especially things like close-ups as a manifestation of attention and flashbacks as a manifestation of memory. Arnheim was interested in the imageness of the cinematic image, insisting that it's not just a reproduction of reality, but a transformation of it. And Balazs and Epstein really in this unit are going to focus on this one thing. So think about what we can do by channeling all of our energy into just one technique or one singular aspect, the close-up. That's what we're going to focus on today. And I want to give us three terms for understanding the preoccupations of Balazs and Epstein, who are different film theorists but have a lot in common, even though the kind of enthusiasm of their writing is going to seem like a departure from the kind of steady, kind of logical argumentation that you'll get from Munsterberg and Arnheim, both of whom, remember, are trained psychologists, or at least they have an investment in psychology and in the academic study of the workings of the mind. These two theorists are going to be interested and influenced a lot more by contemporary French philosophy, really. We're going to get into that in a bit. So let's go back to this list. Revelation, expression, and duration. All of these words are terms that you are familiar with, but we're going to be using them in slightly distinct, specialized ways. So what do I mean by revelation? You can think about revelation as the argument that cinema is analogous to a microscope or another kind of instrument of revealing the visual world, revealing aspects of the world that are hidden to natural perception. And Epstein will actually use this phrase, possibilities are already appearing for the drama of the microscope. And the best known account of revelation as a concept that guides classical film theory is from a text that we're not reading. It's a secondary source, a book called Doubting Vision, Film in the Revelationist Tradition, by a film scholar named Malcolm Turvey. But he offers this concept, which I think is quite useful for understanding what Balazs and Epstein have in common, and in fact, something that is in common with a lot of classical film theorists. So he writes at the outset of his book, classical film theorists adhered for the most part to the doctrine of medium specificity, the view that in order for the cinema to be accepted as a legitimate art, it must be shown to possess valuable attributes of its own, ones that the other pre-established arts do not have. Needless to say, theorists propose different answers to these questions. One such answer is that the cinema's most significant property, one which the other arts do not possess, or at least don't possess to the same degree, is its ability to uncover features of reality invisible to human vision. The value of this property is that it can reveal the true nature of reality to viewers, and the techniques best suited to exploiting it are those that least resemble human sight. I call this the revelationist answer. So, while I don't want to wholly subscribe to Turvey's picture of revelationism, I do want to use that term as a way of categorizing a concept of thought that recurs throughout these theorists. But I want to say it recurs in different manifestations. When Turvey says, and the techniques best suited to exploiting it are those that least resemble human sight, what he means quite literally are techniques like these, like time-lapse photography, in which it is a capacity of film to show time in a way that's impossible for my human vision to comprehend through time lapse, right? Think about, I don't have the ability to see the world unfold in this way. An opposite, though similar observation or technique is slow motion, right? Because of the very fact of cinema, that it can change its rate of recording, I can see aspects of the world unfolding that are too fast for my vision to comprehend. And think about not just the temporal aspect, but the spatial aspect, microscopic imagery, and we might even say, that as an offshoot of microscopic imagery, the more ordinary close-up. And the degree to which this is something that I can't perceive in real life is a question that I might pose to you. To what degree is the close-up really something that ordinary perception cannot capture? Certainly not in the same way that a microscopic image is impossible for me to see. But I want you to kind of keep this rhetoric alive as a way to something to investigate as you read through. So that's what I mean by revelation. If I use that word in class, I don't just mean something. I don't mean something religious, and I don't just mean the very fact of revealing something. I mean this idea that cinema can reveal that which is invisible or otherwise inaccessible to human perception. Number two, something related to revelation is expression. I don't simply mean just the normal or the ordinary use of that word. I want to think of the kind of etymological basis of expression, the idea of squeezing something out, that there's something contained within an object or a body, and there's a way that we can get that thing that's inside and then express it outward, like squeezing the water out of a sponge. But in this case, we're thinking about the relationship between the contents of a mind and a body or a face's ability to express or manifest the contents of the mind. And you might guess that the close-up for both of these thinkers, but though in different ways, might be a way to grant access to the contents of the mind, a tool, that is, of expression. So Balazs will say this at the beginning of his book, Visible Man. He'll say, "For the man of visual culture is not like a deaf mute who replaces words with sign language. He does not think in words whose syllables he inscribes in the air with the dots and dashes of the Morse code. His gestures do not signify concepts at all, but are the direct expression of his own non-rational self. And whatever is expressed in his face and his movements arises from a stratum of the soul that can never be brought to the light of day by words. Here the body becomes unmediated spirit, spirit rendered visible, wordless." So, and once you read the introduction, you'll get a better context of what he's saying here. But right now I just want to kind of summarize one of Balazs' main points, which is that the emphasis on written communication that Balazs thinks has kind of dominated Western civilization and suffused 20th century thought, has suppressed what he thinks is a more natural or primordial ability to express the contents of ourselves through our bodies and through our faces, that is, through the surface. And he thinks that there is a kind of tarnished version of communication that comes through language and an untarnished, more pure or pure spirit through the body. So you might imagine, for a silent era film theorist, film seems a pretty good medium for teaching us, once again, how to read or grant ourselves access to the expressions of souls through bodies, given that film gives us pictures of bodies in motion and doesn't grant our ability to hear speech. He'll continue, "Modern philologists and historians of language have established that the origins of language are to be found in expressive movements. The fact that he uttered sounds at the same time was a secondary phenomenon. When subsequently exploited for practical purposes, the immediately visible spirit was then transformed into a mediated, audible spirit, and which was lost in the process, as in all translation. But the language of gestures is the true mother tongue of mankind." So this is that kind of idea crystallized here that I was mentioning just a moment ago. Language, he thinks, is a mediation, whereas the movements of the body and of the face, he thinks, are a less mediated, more pure access to what's going on inside of a mind, or what he'll call a soul. And you can see similar issues in John Epstein. He'll write, "The close-up is drama in high gear. I can see love. It half lowers its eyelids, raises the arc of the eyebrows laterally, inscribes itself on the taut forehead." So the idea that, and Epstein is far more poetic with his writing than Balazs is. When he says, "I can see love," I think what he's trying to do is say that the kind of abstract concept of love gets so written into a facial expression that I don't see a face translating or, say, acting the expression of love. I see it immediately right there on the face. This is the kind of argument that Epstein and Balazs will similarly make about the close-up and the face and the body's ability to express what we might call the contents of minds and souls, that which is inside. Third is a concept called duration. And by duration, I do mean something similar to what we would call, say, like the duration of time, like the duration of the movie was 2 hours. It is related to that ordinary use of the term. But I'm speaking in particular about a philosophical concept from a French philosopher named Henri Bergson, who was heavily influential upon both Bela Balazs and John Epstein. If you're familiar with Bergson, you'll see his ideas rampant throughout both of these thinkers, but Balazs himself will actually invoke the name of Bergson in one of our readings. So Balazs will summarize one kind of concept from Bergson's notion of duration, or in the French, durée, as follows. Balazs says, "Henri Bergson's analysis of duration and time can help us to gain an understanding of this novel dimension. A melody," Bergson asserts, "consists of individual notes that follow one another in time, but despite this, the melody has no extension in time. For from the vantage point of the first note, the last one is already implicit, and on the last note, the first one is still interpretively present. That is what makes every note part of a melody, which latter as a form has a duration, a course to run, and yet exists as a totality from the outset instead of gradually coming into being in time. For the melody is not just the notes, but their audible relationship. This relationship is not temporal, it exists in a different spiritual dimension. Physiognomy, or say the ability to recognize a face as a whole, has a relation to space comparable to that existing between melody and time." So this seems very difficult and dense, hard to figure out, and one of the reasons I want to bring up Bergson is because I don't think it's a trivial connection in bringing up Bergson here. So I want to talk about this passage, and I want to talk about a little more broadly about what Henri Bergson's all about and why he's influencing Balazs and Epstein. So first, this idea of the melody. What the heck is Bela Balazs trying to say about a melody having no extension in time, even though it consists of individual notes that follow one another in time? So the first thing I want to do is simply try to explain what Balazs is saying about the melody through Bergson's notion of duration. It's quite difficult, but the way I can kind of break it down is basically one of Bergson's major arguments about how we experience time as distinct from how time is understood in a kind of scientific worldview as a succession of equally distant moments that we break down into these very conveniently organized units like seconds or minutes or hours or days and weeks and years. Bergson wants to say, fine and good that we have a way of measuring time, but that doesn't actually tell us much about what time is as an experience. He wants to say that duration is the word he's giving for the non-quantifiable form of time as a flow of subjective consciousness. So Bergson will say, we experience time as a whole, also even though we break it down into seconds and minutes. So in the melody Happy Birthday to You, which I have written out here, indeed I can organize it into these mathematically precise bits of notation. They're both kind of spatially distant, and they're kind of marked temporally. But when you think of the melody, Happy Birthday to You, it is itself a kind of whole. It's not equivalent to the sum of its notes. It is experienced as a whole thing. What happens when I sing Happy Birthday to You, and then I go da da na na na, and I stop? Your mind anticipates the next note. It's almost impossible because I've broken the whole. So I might say that following Bergson and following Balazs's invocation of him, a melody is experienced as a temporal whole despite being broken down into discrete notes. Memory, sensation, and anticipation all blend together, even though you might say they happen in these kind of temporally distinct markers. Bergson's whole philosophy is to describe the way in which time is a subjectively experienced thing that cannot be quantified. So Nonquantification is the name of the game when you're talking about Bergson's philosophy. He'll look at a kind of physics chart measuring the trajectory of the baseball, and he'll say, that's great for doing physics, but really I want you to think about the way in which time t equals 0 or time t equals 1 is a poor way to understand time as the thing that we are living inside of, or that is the content of our subjective consciousness. So this is Bergson's philosophy. What does this have to do with faces? One of Balazs's reasons for bringing up Bergson on the melody when he's talking about something as spatial as a close-up of a face is because he wants to hammer home the idea that I can't quantify the face into discrete parts that themselves communicate bits of information. He wants to say, when I look at Falconetti's face in Joan of Arc, like I'm doing here, it hits me in one whole. He, in fact, wants to say, what I'm seeing is her soul. I'm seeing her interiority. I'm seeing her emotion. He's saying what I'm not seeing are these tiny movements that I then pause, think about, calculate, and then deduce that those micro movements suggest that she is experiencing a dark sadness mixed with a kind of turmoil and also a sense of self-righteousness or something like that. He wants to say, I'm getting it directly. Of course, this is a kind of poetic argument, and one that you have to ask, well, what are the grounds for this argument? What we're trying to do is to figure out what it is about the medium of film that would lead someone to make such a bold claim. A related concept in Bergson's philosophy that you're going to see in Balazs and in Epstein, and which we can actually think about as related to what we've been talking about with this suspicion of quantification, is an equivalent suspicion of signs or language as something that we might imagine is adequate translation of the contents of the world or the contents of the mind. So Bergson, in one of his books, will say, in order to think movement, a constantly renewed effort of the mind is necessary. Signs are made to dispense us with this effort by substituting for the moving continuity of things an artificial reconstruction. So Bergson is going to be not suspicious of language and numbers and quantification on the face of it. He's more so just suspicious that people mistake language and numbers and quantification as equivalent to or exhaustive of the phenomena of the world, that is what's out there, and the phenomena of experience itself. He always wants to say that there are some things that language, words, and numbers are not going to account for. And you can see how much this kind of thinking infuses the thought of our thinkers on the close-up. Epstein, for example, in one of his essays that I'm not asking you to read, but I think this is a useful example, says, we say red, soprano, sweet, cypress, when there are only velocities, movements, vibrations. In other words, a very Bergsonian sentence, Epstein is trying to get us to understand that these terms are merely abstractions that we've agreed upon as referring to certain properties or maybe things in the world. But he wants to say, He wants to remind us that they are themselves merely human constructed abstractions, whereas if I ask what's actually in the world, it's something like the ineffability of vibration, of rhythm, of movement. So Epstein will sometimes slip into these kind of grand philosophical proclamations about the limitations of language, but you should also see this as very much related to the opening of Bela Balazs' book, The Visible Man, which I've asked you to read, in which he thinks that the dominance of language, the kind of the primacy of the printing press as the technology that is the most influential thing, is obscuring the fact that there are ways of accessing the world and ourselves that are beyond language. And that's why they're so excited about silent film. Once again, this is about a film before sound, before talkies. The idea that when we look at a face on the big screen, for these thinkers, it can seem to express contents of the mind that almost defy an easy translation into words. Even though you'll see throughout these pieces of writing, most of what they're trying to do is in some sense find words adequate to describing their experience of these things, because film theory is a medium conducted in language, ironically enough. But this is something that I want you to think about as you're reading. Okay, so we'll talk about these readings in class, and we'll talk about how they relate to our film, The Master, in a bit. Thanks.